Hello, my assiduous art sluts. It's Allison Moon, and you are listening to an Artgasm Quickie. On today's episode, well, I just want to admit that I had a hard time with this one this week. Honestly, I'm struggling with just the idea of what I have to say that means anything. I think my natural inclination when I feel exasperated or overwhelmed is to shut up, is to silence myself and to just hold space for those who need to speak. Even when I feel like I'm being wronged or even when I feel like I'm being misunderstood, I think it's my natural inclination, even as loquacious as I am, to just shut up and lean back. Which is, hard when you have a podcast and you're committing to sharing something every week. But it actually inspired me to think a little bit hard about the topic that I had originally planned to speak to and then kind of where it led me. So earlier this week, I read a great Twitter thread by a writer named Summer Brennan, and she wrote about, it was a brief thread, but it was a very thoughtful thread about American Gothic. American Gothic, the very famous painting, one of the American iconic paintings. And if I were to ask you to describe that painting, if you were to ask me to describe that painting, odds are you or I would say something like American Gothic was a early 20th century portrait of Americana featuring a farmer and his wife in front of their farmhouse. And you could go on from there. If you knew more about painting, you could probably say something along the lines of inspired by Flemish masters, or honestly, most of us believe or see a husband and wife in front of that farmhouse. The man holding the pitchfork, the woman looking off into the distance. And Summer Brennan suggested, argued, said that we would be wrong because what is depicted is not a husband and wife, but rather a father and a daughter. And Grant Wood, the painter himself, confirmed this. The models he chose were his dentist, who was in his early 60s at the time, and his sister, who was in her early 30s at the time. And if you look at the painting, and Brennan does a great job of explaining just the composition of the painting in this way, you'll see that they're in a traditionally father-daughter pose. The father is in front of the daughter is looking off into the distance. She's not looking in the same direction as the father. Some people certainly read that her looking off into the distance while he's looking at the viewer in an almost challenging pose while holding a pitchfork is some sort of challenge against who might be leering at his daughter, this kind of classic American trope of the father being overprotective of his adult daughter, etc., etc. There's a lot of beautiful ways to interpret this picture, but I think most of us do see a husband and wife, and ultimately we are not correct. I loved Summer Brennan's explanation of this and the ways that we assume what we know based on the tropes that we appreciate. I mean, I think it's very common, even nowadays, for us to assume that it's natural for a man to be 30 years older than his wife. It's not weird in the ways that we see femininity, in the ways that we see womanhood. The fact that the woman in the painting doesn't look like a young flower. She looks like a woman. She's got age lines on her face, but she's not nearly as aged as the father. So we have these ideas of what a woman should look like. And what Brennan was doing in her thread was just explaining like, hey, a lot of us have these assumptions when we go into view any sort of art. And it's a really good idea for us to check ourselves and really deconstruct what we assume to be the truth. And then we don't go any further than that. And Brennan was just saying, hey, we should go further than that. We should be willing to deconstruct our assumptions. So that by itself is a great lesson, right? Like learning about, the art of seeing and learning how to deconstruct ourselves and our assumptions. As an art lesson, it's a very basic lesson, right? When you learn to draw or paint or any sort of visual art, one of the very first things that you learn how to do is to draw what is actually in front of you, not what you think you see. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of artists and art teachers teach you to not look at the paper at all. Look at what you're looking at, look at what you're painting, look at what you're drawing, and do not look at your hand, because as soon as you look at your hand and the lines that you're drawing, you lose track of what's actually there and you start drawing from memory. And your memory is going to be flawed by the very nature of the human brain. So this is a very basic art tenet. But what I thought was so interesting about this thread was that there were some indignant responses to Brennan basically just stating the facts. The facts that Wood, the painter, said, oh yeah, no, this is a father and daughter, and yeah, this is a 30-year age difference. This I clearly, this was the painting that he created, and he was able to speak to that. But a lot of people were mad at Summer Brennan for even just acknowledging that, because they had their assumptions challenged. And, they probably didn't go on Twitter that day assuming that they were going to have something that they just kind of took for granted being told that they're wrong. Because we don't like being told that we're wrong, right? We think we know the answer, and we want to be right. Because it's not just about being right, it's about being smart. And in the ways that we understand so many things these days, particularly art, to be wrong is to be considered stupid, to not have the right way of seeing the world. And especially these days, a lot of us our egos are so attached to being right all the time that many of us would rather not be corrected and live our lives wrong rather than face the indignity of being told that we are incorrect in an assumption. And of course, the great fear of being wrong isn't just being proven stupid. It's that there's so much emotion attached to the opinion that we hold. And this is why it's so hard with art. Because by their very nature, great works of art are filled with people's assumptions and attachments. This is particularly true of film, because so many of us have incredibly formative experiences with film early on in our lives, such that we form these strong emotional attachments to them, and those emotional attachments follow us through our lives. And so it becomes really hard to have any sort of conversation about rightness and wrongness when it comes to art. Certainly when what's at stake is not necessarily facts. It's not, hey, BT dubs, that couple in American Gothic, they're not a husband and wife, they're a father and daughter, and there's verifiable evidence to point to it. That's one thing. But when we say, hey, actually this film was a better representation of these characters than that film, or this director got it right and that director didn't. Hello, I mean, it's yesterday was May 4th, and there was a lot of conversation about Star Wars. And if you really want to create some sense of being wrong on the internet, having an opinion about a Star Wars film is a really great way of doing it. Because, again, formative opinions created young in life. A lot of us have experiences with those films, and we believe that our interpretation is the correct one. And anything that contradicts that is contradicting not only our opinion, but our identity. There's a great podcast that I strongly recommend that you listen to called You Are Not So Smart. That's the name of the entire podcast. And he devoted a series of episodes to changing one's mind. And this, of course, has become a huge issue in politics as of late. The idea of what it takes to convince somebody of your point of view and what it takes to disabuse them of some incorrect information. And how challenging it is, not just because people don't want to feel stupid or people don't want to believe scary truths, but because the emotions of being right are so ingrained into our identities that in order to be a true Scotsman, in order to be a correct Democrat or a correct Republican or a correct queer or whatever, I mean, any identity label you can throw, there are these boxes you need to check, these things that you need to believe, and you need to believe publicly and appropriately in order to be considered part of that crowd. And so if you have a differing opinion about any of the hot button issues around the political strata or around sexual identity or around, Star Wars, right? You are quite literally risking your ability to be part of that crowd. And so if changing your opinion is less about just deciding, hey, I like this film more than that one, but rather about, I am leaving this community to wander the deserts alone, hopefully finding a new community that will accept me. Well, that shit's real hard. That shit's real scary. And so, of course, we are terrified of being wrong, because being wrong in our current society means being forced out of a community, of an identity, of being told that we can no longer hold something that is true for us because we don't fit the profile. And this calcification of identity is really frightening to me, really intensely frightening to me, because I've certainly experienced it firsthand, and I've certainly witnessed it secondhand, of this idea of being proven wrong publicly and uncharitably, such that it's not about, hey, that was not a correct opinion, allow me to quietly correct you or share with you some information, but rather to be dragged and to be flogged and to be humiliated. And that defense is so strong now that even when somebody says, hey, the way you've interpreted that painting is actually factually incorrect, it's cool if you see it this way, but I just wanted to correct the record that this is actually what the artist intended. Even something as mild as that kind of correction will create in many of us a strong emotional reaction anyway, a defensive reaction where we have to defend our honor anyway. Even though we weren't necessarily attacked, we still feel like we have to combat and we have to prove our rightness in order to just preserve our sense of self. And personally, I actually have a lot of skin in this game, not because of my love of art, but actually because of my career as a sex educator. Because as a sex educator, my job is giving people advice and giving people the most up-to-date, accurate information I can about bodies and relationships. And it's frightening contemplating being wrong. Not only because being wrong attaches, again, all these emotions about whether or not I'm a good sex educator or whatnot, but because being wrong could conceivably do harm. Being wrong could create worse outcomes for the people I speak to. And so I think one of the reasons why I've had such a hard time personally with recording podcasts like this or, creating stuff at all is because I have this great fear of making things worse for people. And again, being proven doing it publicly and uncharitably, and at times cruelly. And so it creates this dissonance of wanting to just silence myself, wanting to not share anything, lest I be proven wrong, lest somebody say, hey, you were wrong about that thing 8 years ago, aren't you stupid? But also because misinformation is the bane of the sex educator's existence, and it is what we're constantly grappling against. I mean, anybody in any sort of health field can probably speak to this, particularly at this moment, quite dramatically. People don't want to believe us because their truths, the ideas that they have about themselves and their bodies feel safer. Sometimes we have to share unkind truths, frightening truths, but still truths, and we're doing it because we care. I feel like, though, part of my anxiety about my career is this: I consider myself part of what I, say, like the advice industrial complex, that so much of our lives, so much of our jobs is to tell people how to live their lives. And I try very hard to not be didactic. And at the same time, there are certain lies that I have to disabuse people of in order to be a responsible educator. And so I'm in this position of having to give people information that frightens them, that makes them uncomfortable, and that often they find emotionally challenging, I'll say charitably. And that's just the fact-based stuff. There are plenty of things in sex education where I can point to a textbook and say, hey, actually, we know how this works and this is how it is. But when we talk about sex, we're obviously almost always talking about emotions, hearts, minds, the psychology of interacting human beings, and that stuff's a lot more nebulous. And then it becomes hunches, then it becomes best practices, then it becomes frameworks and ideas for how we can interpret that stuff. Again, kind of back to the analogy of what Summer Brennan was talking about with American Gothic. Like, we have a framework for how a man and a woman stand in a portrait when they are married and when they are not. So we can point to a historical precedent and say, this is kind of how this works. We're pretty sure we can look at this and see that this means this thing. And in sex education, I can do the same thing. We are pretty sure that this is how human beings interact with each other in these ways. This is generally how it works. And maybe your partner is responding in this way because of X, Y, and Z. But again, these are just hunches. These are just models. These are just ideas for how to proceed. Where I find myself really uncomfortable right now is that I don't feel like the world needs more people telling them how to live their lives. I think right now, so many of us are just deluged with the advice industrial complex. We're deluged with people telling us that this is the way you should eat, and this is the way you should raise your kids, and this is the way you should train your pets, and this is the way you should live, and this is how... I mean, there's just so much. There's so much. And I think part of me is responding to this so muchness with feeling like I need to withdraw and silence and be quiet and just let the loudness wash over me. And that may or may not be the right thing to do. I understand the irony, as here I am speaking into a microphone and sharing it with the world about my opinions. But I feel like this is where I'm at right now with just my opinions, is that I'm so tired of listening to my opinions, but I still feel like there are times that I have things to share, and there are things that I want to ask of the world. And I feel like part of what I'm doing with the podcast, and very much part of what I'm doing with my sex education, and entirely what I'm doing with my dramatic writing, is creating inquiry as opposed to instruction manuals. I really want to ask more questions and sit with the complexity and allow for the complications of things, and invite people to share their own thoughts and the things that they're grappling with as well. That's where the juice is for me right now. But I also find that to be really hard, because there's this whole world of people who are also looking for the quickest fixes. And there's a whole world of misinformation that I do feel like it's part of my ethics to correct. And I think a lot of us are having a really hard time telling the difference between what is a fact-based inquiry and what is an opinion-based inquiry. What is a thing we can verify with science and say, actually, we know how this works and here it is, and what really is a matter of opinion and taste. And I want to be clear. I don't think there's anything wrong with having strong emotions attached to our opinions. I think that that's natural and human, and I think that in many ways that can be quite beautiful and create really wonderful things. But I do think that I fear when we are so unwilling to be proven wrong that we ignore very clear facts, that we deny evidence, and that we scorn and ridicule people who are either presenting an alternative viewpoint or are actually presenting us with facts that would negate our own. That is something that I am really, really having a hard time with. And I have a feeling a lot of people that listen to this are as well. And of course, I have no solutions, because if I had solutions, then that would mean I was being didactic, and I don't do that anymore. Anyway, this is an ongoing inquiry. I'm certainly open to hearing what you have to say about this and hearing what you think about all of this. I know that a lot of people are feeling the same way I am these days about the flood, the deluge, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. So, as always, you can reach out to me on the Twitter at HeyAllieMoon. You can find me online at artgasmcast.com or on Patreon at patreon.com/artgasm. Let me know what you think. And, be willing to be wrong. I'll talk to you next week. Thanks. Bye.